Let's talk about what's going on in Israel. A stunning, I don't mean to use this word lightly, but a stunning new vaccine cover-up story coming out of Israel that you won't see reported on any major news outlet that I can find, because they're all funded by Pfizer. If you don't believe me, here you go.
Good Morning America is brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch sponsored by Pfizer.
Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer. Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer.
Yeah, so you're not going to see any mainstream media coverage about this story. But for some context here, in the United States, we have what's known as the VAERS system, VAERS. That's an acronym, right? Because you can say it.
It is an acronym.
We say it as VAERS. It's not an initialism, which you can't pronounce. So it's the VAERS system, which is the Vaccine Adverse Effects Reporting System. So when someone has an adverse effect, the hospital is able to report it. They are able to report it. And then guess what? The Centers for Disease Control and the FDA can monitor the situation. They can study this data, right, and make an informed decision about it. Now, by the way, the only reason we actually have this system is if you have to go back to 1986 when 13 children were given a vaccine for diphtheria and pertussis. I don't know what pertussis is. Do you know what pertussis?
It's whooping cough.
Whooping
I
cough?
think.
Okay. And tetanus. I know what tetanus is. That's the thing you get from like rusty nails, right? So you don't want to get
yes.
that. You get a tetanus. You got to get the tetanus shot. All of that stuff. So diphtheria, pertussis, all of that. Well, guess what? These 13 kids, they died. 1986. Horrible, right? Imagine that. You take your kids for this. You think it's going to be fine. It wasn't.
In fact, they call this DTaP.
DTaP. Okay, so this
Yeah.
is the DTaP one. Yeah. It was an outrage. People were outraged about it. I mean, in the 1980s, right? Dying from this, it prompted Congress and the Reagan administration into action to pass the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act at the time. Here it is. Here's a look at it. You can read through it if you'd like. And it came with the VAERS system then. The VAERS system was put in place so that any abnormality would be registered in a central database, and the FDA and the CDC could jump into action, right? And pull these vaccines off the shelf if there was some kind of an issue.
Oh, that would be nice.
Right? That's the
good.
whole point.
You got to have a plan.
That's the whole freaking point of the VAERS system. That's the whole point of this 1986 legislation. Now, remember, this is incredibly important because these COVID vaccines were rushed to market, bypassing years of clinical trials, right? And getting emergency use authorization, right? So in the absence of any long-term clinical trials, we're basically relying then on real world usage. It's almost like when, I hate to say it like this, but it's true, but like when Apple has their now public beta for like new iOS, they roll it out. They've been testing their new software for a while, but not until they really get it out into millions of people's hands do they find like a lot of problems with it, right? So because we don't have clinical trials of years of data, which you should normally, and because these bypassed all of those long-winded clinical trials, which would maybe prove efficacy and safety, we now have to rely on the VAERS system for that, which is sad. We're like using human guinea pigs, basically.
Well,
So
and
for
also, as Peter McCullough and them have pointed out, the VAERS system, they said you're lucky if you're getting 1 to 2% reported because it takes 45 minutes to an hour to fill it out, and it's a very complex thing, and you have to be able to answer certain questions that most people can't answer. So it's a very complex system.
Thank you for saying that,
Yeah.
because I just want to put a pin in what David just said there about just that's very, very important what he just said. So hold on to that little thought like a balloon. Just hold on to it because we're going to come back to what he just said. This is incredibly important. So in the absence of these long-winded trials, we have to rely on these VAERS reporting of these vaccines, right? So for instance, when blood clots suddenly showed up, remember this? They suddenly started showing up for people that took the AstraZeneca shot.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened? Do you guys remember what happened? Well, what happened was that suddenly with the COVID jabs, reports were submitted to the VAERS system that led to the additional scrutiny. They started looking more closely at it. And guess what? Then it was taken off the shelf. Yes, AstraZeneca's shot was taken off the shelf. It was suspended. And countries around the world took it off, like started reporting his problems and took it off the shelf. So because these doctors and pharmaceutical companies, pharmacists, excuse me, because doctors, pharmacists, statisticians, they said that the risk wasn't worth the benefit. There was more risk with this AstraZeneca than there was the benefit of preventing COVID. So they said. So there were too many problems, so they took it off the shelf. But now back to Israel now. So which had the highest vaccination rate in the world. They, of all countries, didn't have a way to report adverse effects like the United States did. Imagine that. So at the end
That is outrageous, considering that Israel can have like fighter planes in the air in less than 30 seconds or something. Like they're one of the fastest militaries in the world.
Think about the Iron Dome that they have, right?
Right. And they were the first to issue boosters to people over a certain age. The second, third, and fourth, that Israel was the first to do this, considering that they had no adverse effect system, but they just kept going.
Yeah. And then, I mean, it was really awful. They had nothing in place, nothing. And so they, of all countries, didn't have a way to report this, right? They were like the test bed for these vaccines, Israel was. They were the guinea pigs, quite honestly. Like the United States had the VAERS system, the UK had their own reporting system, Israel, nothing. So again, Israel, at the end of 2021, the Israeli Ministry of Health launched their own adverse effects reporting system. But it was nothing like what the United States had. Frankly, it was nothing like what the United Kingdom had either. It basically asked a few doctors to pull together some data and do a study. So they decided that they were going to start studying adverse effects at hospitals across Israel starting in December of 2021. Now, just think about that for a second. That data, they were only given 6 months to look at. So from December until May, they were just going to look at 6 months of data.
Okay.
From 2021 into 2022, we are currently in 2022 right now. No, it doesn't feel like it. Who knows where we are anymore? But that means that they missed an entire year in 2021 of data. The most important year of data, right? When everyone was being vaccinated. Because when did these things start? They started in what, December?
December of 2020.
Yeah. So put a pin in that for a moment, right? So they wrap up their study in May of this year in Israel. And then months go by, and then the Israeli people start asking questions. You know, Israel, like, what's going on here? What's going on? Where is the findings of this 6-month report? What's happening with this? Why are you hiding this from us? Like, the report wrapped up 2 months ago. What's going on here? Then finally, on August 2nd, they released, just a month ago, the Israeli Ministry of Health finally releases their report on these adverse events. Remember, this is the report from December through May. Here is that report. Now, I know you don't read Hebrew, but the report was out. And it basically said, nothing to see here. Don't worry, nothing here. Nothing to hear, worry about. There's no adverse effects. Nothing really pertaining at all, so you don't really have to worry about this. Well, guess what? A newly leaked video. Don't you love newly leaked videos?
Yes, I do. They give us so much to talk about on this show.
I'm wondering, like, when are we going to get past the era where we have, like, newly leaked videos? You know, like, are people going to get so used to the fact that always things are being recorded and that it's going to leak out, like, that we won't get that kind of reporting anymore?
Yeah.
You know? But for now, we had a bunch of doctors on a Zoom call, and this Zoom meeting, they were meeting about this report. So all the doctors got together in June to present their findings. And they're on this Zoom call going over it. They were meeting to discuss all of the data that they've been analyzing. In fact, the doctors who were hired by the Ministry of Health to carry out the study found all kinds of problems. In fact, they found more problems than Pfizer had found in its own trials. More than Pfizer, which also, by the way, was keeping it quiet and covered up until we got court documents that forced them and to show us what was going on with these vaccines, right? So the exact opposite was later printed in this report. They found more problems than what Pfizer found, a whole laundry list of issues, and then the report that was printed mentioned none of it.
So shocking.
What you're about to see was first covered by Neil Oliver over at GB News. They got their hands on a Zoom meeting with the leaked video. It took place in June between Israeli Ministry of Health officials and the doctors with this research. Now, Professor Retzef Levy says that these doctors found some horrible things in their research. Here he is going to highlight two of the problems: women's menstruation, which we covered on this show, and then brain problems. Okay? Yes, neurological problems. Listen.
Let me highlight two of those. So the first one is about the menstrual irregularities. As you know, once the vaccine campaign started, many women reported about menses irregularities. And like many cases during the last year, the immediate response was very dismissive and basically the response was, okay, this is just a temporal coincidence. When these reports persisted, the narrative changed a little bit, and people were willing to acknowledge that maybe there's a possible relationship to the vaccine, but the phenomena is short-term. What the finding of this research team were very, very clear about, that the side effects are definitely caused by the vaccine because of the rechallenge phenomena, and they also last for weeks, months, over a year, and sometimes still ongoing at the time of the report was given to the Ministry of Health. The neurological side effects is even more interesting. The form that the electronic form that the Ministry of Health created to allow patients to report had two parts. One of them was a closed form part where you were actively asked about specific side effects, and that form didn't even include neurological symptoms. At the same time, or nevertheless, when they analyzed the free text part of the form, where patients were allowed to report whatever they wanted to, they observed and they got many, many reports of neurological side effects. Again, some that are not listed currently by Pfizer as side effects of the vaccine. And again, based on the rechallenge phenomena, they could see both a definite causal relationship with the vaccine and, again, long-term side effects that lasted weeks, months, and sometimes over a year.
So what he just said is exactly what David mentioned earlier. I just want to kind of combine those 2 points here a second, right? So what he said was there was no place on the form
for neurological disorders.
Yeah. So when they were doing their research in Israel, they couldn't even fill out on the form because there was no place for it. Like, do you have neurological problems? Oh, sorry, there's nothing listed here. It's just like, do I have a pain in my arm? There's nothing here about neurological. So I had to wait until I got down to the box that said, hey, do you have any other stuff? Like the free box that you could fill in. So,
well, and also during the trials, when people were going through the trials initially that were reported, they had a list of things that they could choose from, and there was no box for them to add other things. So that's why a lot of data didn't actually get reported in the trials, because they didn't, and anybody who complained of anything outside of that were removed from the trials.
Well,
Right.
much like the trials for oxytocin is the main...
For when you're having a baby?
Oxycontin, the main drug that is fueling the opioid crisis, right?
Right.
When the FDA did clinical trials for that, they allowed the pharmaceuticals to take people off of the VAERS system who had adverse reactions. The FDA knew that and allowed it.
So, you know,
and again, in the app where you go to report, you have a drop down and you can only select certain things. Like, you cannot select something that's not on there.
Yeah. So to think about the United States VAERS drop down menu thing that David's talking about, right? Like how difficult it is to go through that process. Like in the United States, think how much more data we could have if the system was even easier to access and get information, right? So we have a fraction of the data in the United States, right? And now Israel has 6 months of data from doctors digging through, and the stuff that they found is jaw-dropping. So, I mean, this is where, here's the leaked video now. This is where the doctors lay out all of the problems. In this video, you're going to hear doctors admitting that they discovered many adverse effects that stay in the body and do not go away. This video is subtitles because the language is Hebrew, so watch.
תופעות נוירולוגיות, זיהינו בעצם תופעות חדשות שלא מופיעות בעלון לצרכן, כמו סחרחורות, טינטונים, היפוסטזיות, פרסטזיות, שריר שלד, גילינו בעצם שזה די דומה, התופעות שעלו בדיווחים הן די דומות למה שצוין בעלון, למעט ה-back pain שהיה מאוד נפוץ בדיווחים. אז הוספנו פה עוד איזשהו, בעצם גילינו עוד איזושהי תופעה שעליה לא דווח בעלון. ושוב פעם, הפער המשמעותי היה באמת באפיון של משך התופעה, שבעלון היה כתוב באופן מפורש שהתופעות האלה אמורות לחלוף תוך מספר ימים, ואנחנו ראינו שזה לא ככה, כי ב-50% מהדיווחים שבהם צוין בכלל משך, היה משך של למעלה מחצי שנה.
Here in this slide, the researchers present an example of how people described in their own words new side effects. The example shown here is hypoesthesia. Half an hour after the first vaccination, my legs started to feel numb. This continued until the second vaccination. When the second vaccine was administered, the sensation also appeared in the hands, neck, and face, and the numbness continues even these days. The symptom reappears every day.
Okay.
The symptoms reappear every day. So this is fraud by the Israeli Ministry of Health. Their doctors found all kinds of causal relationships with the vaccines and these long-term symptoms, but the report covered it up. The report that was presented to the Israeli people was a fabrication. I don't know any other word for it. Blatant fraud.
It was scrubbed.
Faked. I mean, I don't know.
I just want to mention too, there was a Facebook group that was formed for people that were having that electronic sensation or that feeling of electricity. They described it in their head and their fingers and legs. And they were up over 3,000 members when Facebook finally deleted the group. So that's, I mean, you think 3,000 people that just happened to find each other, that is telling to how many it probably really affected.
Oh, remember how Eric Clapton was canceled for saying that, right? Yeah.
He said like he didn't think he was ever going to play guitar again.
Right.
Right.
And then he became the persona non grata.
Right.
Is that how you say
now
that?
he's the Trump supporting anti-vaxxer.
Yeah, right.
Right.
So, like he just gets lumped into some bucket, right?
Yeah.
Even though he's British. And in fact, what we now know is the boosters made it dramatically worse. Came out in this data. With each new booster, according to the doctor's findings, the symptoms got worse and the toxicity in the body got worse. Two other major findings by the doctors specifically stood out to me, and it had to do with children, where they found digestive problems long-term for children and skeletal muscular problems in the form of persistent back pain. Just think about that for a minute. The Israeli Ministry of Health sat on these results for nearly 2 months at a time when they could have told a group of experts who was meeting at the time to decide on giving out those vaccines for children under 5. Remember, those were just approved. So they sat on this data and didn't then let the Israeli authorities know that they were seeing all of these other problems with it, and they let those guys go ahead and approve this stuff for children under 5. Imagine what they might have done if they had known this information. It's really disturbing.
Especially when you consider that there was a risk-benefit analysis done for AstraZeneca. Inexplicably,
right.
There was no risk-benefit analysis done for children when you would realize that the risk is higher than the benefit because children are not susceptible to pathological COVID.
I mean, think about it.
Well, then you have to wonder also if it has anything to do with the fact that AstraZeneca is not a U.S. company.
Yeah, well, but neither is Pfizer. Pfizer.
BioNTech.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you just unpack all of this and you think about the way that they went about this, in fact, during the same Zoom call, the head researcher, Professor Mati Berkowitz, can be heard warning the Ministry of Health about how they should present this to the public because he's literally telling this Zoom call that it could open up a massive amount of lawsuits. So we need to figure out how we are going to present this to the public. Watch this.
כאן נצטרך לחשוב גם מדיקו-לגלית. למה מדיקו-לגלית? כי לא מעט תופעות שהיו אמרנו, אוקיי, זה קיים, יש דיווח, אבל בכל תתחסנו. זאת אומרת שלחשוב איך כותבים את זה ואיך מציגים את זה בצורה נכונה, ולא שיהיו אחרי זה תביעות משפטיות, רגע, אתם אמרתם שהכל יחלוף ואפשר להתחסן. והנה עכשיו תראו מה קרה לי.
So he's admitting, he's like, we were telling people to go and do this, and here the data is showing us that we shouldn't have, and we got to figure out how we're going to present this to the people. So,
well, and what really sucks is we're still doing it here. We're still pushing it for kids. We're still pushing it for adults, even though this info's out, more info's out, and it's still being pushed.
And that's a really interesting point, right? Is that the United States, so I have a couple of takeaways on this, right? And to your point, David, I'll use this one first. How much of this data was the United States actively aware of? Because the United States and frankly, the United Kingdom were using Israel as a test bed. And they constantly, remember we were covering this on the show, they constantly were pointing to Israel
as a success. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as an example. And here's why Israel, right? So what data did the United States have in the form of their own VAERS system as it relates to Pfizer's vaccine? And what sort of data were they sitting on that they didn't report to the American people? And what,
well, in my opinion,
in the UK government?
In my opinion, they would not have silenced the doctors that were talking about this stuff if they did not know that. Because why would they?
Right.
Good point.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the other takeaways I have is this, like, who the hell's going to jail for this? You know? I mean, to me, this is crime against humanity.
Right.
To have this information, then sit on it, and then publish a report that hides this information. Why do we have a government?
On a potentially lab-created virus.
Right. Why? I mean, who's going to prison for this?
Yeah.
And what did the American FDA know? You know, I'd love to know that. And then another takeaway, one woman on the Zoom call said that she has thousands of additional reports and she doesn't know what to do with them because they have no reporting system in Israel. So she's literally there with thousands of additional reports on her desk, and they're just sitting there because they don't know what to do with them in Israel.
And presumably she can't send them to a medical journal because they won't be peer reviewed, because most medical journals are like, nah, we can't touch this.
Unbelievable.